Welcoming to this Ask the Psychologist. We're welcoming the public as well as other mental health professionals. This is something we do in part with the North Carolina Psychological Foundation and the Public Education Committee, where what we like to call giving psychology away, which means just providing information about different topics of potential interest to the public, but also mental health professionals. And as you might have heard a few seconds ago, we do record these. So we have a nice, increasingly large archive of different Ask the Psychologist topics that have been recorded over the years now. So feel free to look back at that. But I'm glad you're here today to listen in and learn a little bit about resiliency. And this, you can always go back and look at it later if you'd like. As Karen has said, I'm gonna save time at the end for some questions because I have a lot of material I want to get through. And my hope is to get hopefully through all of it, most of it. And then we'll kind of get to any burning questions either live or write them in the chat. You can see from this initial picture here, I'm talking a little bit about thriving through adversity. We're going to cover first what is the definition of adversity, and then we're going to define resilience, and then we're going to talk about how to kind of thrive through that, getting through that, what I call resilience in action. Where this information is coming from is a lot of different sources. I've been a psychologist for over 30 years now, but I've also spent a lot of time, about close to 20 years, working with the disaster response network of the North Carolina Psychological Foundation. And that was really where my interest in resilience and disaster responding really first began, and learned so much and love to be able to present that as part of what I do in my clinical work. And frankly, also as a human, we all go through things, and I love to be able to present that and apply that to my own life and my own journey because we all have things. So here we go. Let's talk first about. Let me get so I can advance my slides. Uh, Okay. What do we mean by adversity? So really, adversity can mean so many different things to different people. Distress, difficulties, disasters, disorders, disabilities. And there's no right way to define that. It really is however you define it in your own mind. I learned today that the picture on the right, the mask, that today is actually the 6 month or six, sorry, 6 year anniversary of when COVID shutdown occurred, March 13th. So that certainly was a very distressing event for worldwide for many of us. Maybe we didn't realize it on March 13th, but we soon found that out. But it really can be a wide range of things, what we mean by distress. But I also, on the flip side of that, want to talk a little bit about how I think the word trauma, personally, I feel like that ends up getting thrown around a little bit too often, frankly, and or too broadly, I should say, I guess. Not everything distressing is trauma. And I do feel like that gets a little overused. So like this picture of this person sitting in a storm, some people would find that very distressing and some people would find that interesting and fascinating, right? So it would not be correct in my mind to say all storms are distressing or trauma, right? So I just like us to be careful about the words that we throw around. When we talk about trauma or distress, it really is more about what's happening on the inside than it is about the event per se. And sure, events can be distressing and traumatic, and create adversity, absolutely. But I like for us to just maybe be a little bit more nuanced in how we describe that. One way that researchers in this area talk about it is the three E's of trauma. It's about the event, it's about the experience, and it's about the effects. So meaning again, an event, a car accident, a hurricane, war, right? Those are events, right? They can all be distressing, obviously, and traumatic. But what determines whether or not that ends up being a traumatic event for somebody is what is the experience for that person internally, and what are the effects that are happening for that person. So um, it it's again, it's not to minimize somebody, each of us might have different experiences. It's not to say that someone's experience is better or worse. It's just to acknowledge that we all experience that differently. Um, I also like to talk about this idea that there's this movement. Most of us have probably heard of PTSD, stands for post-traumatic stress disorder. Um, but there's this movement to talk more about PTS, so what standing for post-traumatic stress. And I really like that because rather, the word disorder put on the end of PTSD again, I think gets thrown around a little bit too frequently. You see this on influencers or TikTok and those kinds of things. Um, all that is traumatic and stressful is not necessarily a disorder. And we're going to get to that in a few moments. But I like to make that distinction too. There's also been a little bit of a movement to talk more about when something happens that's really difficult or an adversity. Can we talk about it more as a wound than trauma per se? And maybe this is a little bit of a just a semantic difference. But I like that in the sense that we think about, if we have a wound on our body, it does heal. And there might always be that scar tissue or that scar on our arm where we had those stitches, but it does heal. And to me, there's something more hopeful about that than just talking about it as this unhealed trauma per se. So just a few words on trauma. So, all right. A much more to me simple and straightforward way to think about adversity is this. I like acronyms, and I did not make this one up, but this is, when things go nuts. And so when something is novel, unpredictable, when it feels like a threat or a sense of control is low. To me, that really does capture a lot of what makes the difference about whether something is considered traumatic or an adversity of sorts or disastrous. So again, you can plug in if you think about different things. If somebody says, "Oh gosh, it was so traumatic going to the grocery store today. It was so busy." I don't think that would fit the NUTS, criteria per se. It might have been stressful, it might have been inconvenient because it took longer than you had planned on. But so to me, it's interesting. And the one that I find comes up most often is the S, the sense of control being low. Often when we don't have control, when we don't sense that we have control or we don't know what to do, that is a particularly um, important characteristic because that does tend to increase that sense of distress, for a lot of people, as does novelty, unpredictability, a sense of threat, of course. But I just find that that one comes up a lot. All right, so let's talk a little bit about some of before we kind of turn to what to do. I just want to share a few what I find interesting facts about stress and adversity. So some of you might be familiar with the Yerkes-Dodson stress curve, and I like to just put this up there because we're not saying that all stress is bad because it's not. There is helpfulness if we have a deadline, that actually can prompt us to get something done. Or if we know we have somebody coming over for dinner, we're probably a little more on track in terms of, getting groceries or getting things cooked or getting the beds made up, whatever that might mean. But finding where that balance is in terms of if we have too much of that goes into what we call that distress range. But too little of that, sure, we want to be calm, but too little of that, we then don't end up having often that motivation and that drive. So again, part of what happens with adversity is we move from, maybe just kind of what's called that optimal performance stress over that line to distress, where it becomes way too much. So that's not what we're looking for, or that's, problematic, of course. So, okay, let me go to the next one. Okay, another important fact is that when it comes to distress or adversity, trauma, it really can affect all areas. And it's not the same for everybody. I think that's always an interesting point. When I did a lot of work in some of the shelters post a natural disaster, a hurricane or a house fire, it was often, really interesting that, one person and might even been in the same household it might be more somatically focused, so body focused, so it might be more headaches, more stomach aches, more back pain, and for other people it might be more tears, or it might be more shutting down. Other people it might be their symptoms might really focus around spiritual questions. Why did this happen to me? Why did God let this happen? And so again, we just want to be open and receptive to the fact that it's going to be different, and there's also a very different age differences. So what kids might show or demonstrate post disaster or post traumatic event might be different than what the parents might see, right? And so for us all to be aware that, oh, that's interesting. Suddenly, their sleeping is off. So even if that's not happening for the adult, that might be what's going on for the child, or vice versa, actually. So um, it's also important, I think, and I think some of this is intuitive, but not always, that often the physical footprint is of a disaster or a trauma or some adversity is much smaller than the psychological impact. Um, so it's not just the people that are close to the actual, where a shooting happened or where war is going on. Obviously, the people closer to the epicenter of all that are going to be having, different sensations perhaps than the rest of the country or the rest of the world. Um, but what I find sometimes people minimize their own reactions to say, well, why is it that I'm having nightmares? Because that's so far away. And my response would be, well, because that's the ripple effect. That's the psychological ripple effect. It's not just in the small center of the physical footprint. So to kind of have awareness of that. I also want to put out there that, and some of you may have heard of this, the different, victim, survivor, thriver states of mind. And there's some different camps of thinking around this, and what is this really an accurate way to think about it? And, I don't know. It's certainly a simplified way to think about it, but um, I don't find that it's that, oh, one person is a thriver and one person is, victim mentality. Sure, we have different personalities and there might be some tendencies towards some of that. But more often, what I find is it's more like moving through those levels, that, at first, in the beginning, it is overwhelming. And it might feel like, oh my gosh, I don't think I can survive this, or I don't know how I'm going to deal with this. The hope is then, especially if we're using tapping into our resilience tools, which we're going to be talking about momentarily, we're hoping it gets more into survivor mode. This is painful, I'll come through it. And then ideally, thriver mode. I learned from this and there were lessons from this pain. Um, but it's not to be upheld as oh, if you haven't gotten to thriver phase, something's wrong with you. No, no. Um, it's just different, kind of different ways of approaching a disaster or again, adversity or something going on. So, but it sometimes is helpful to know, okay, where are we striving if possible? So, all right. Oh, and just another thing that I learned through a lot of the disaster work is, and I love this phrase, that so much of what we end up experiencing is a normal reaction to an abnormal situation, right? So when the news is distressing, or when there's been an accident, or a natural disaster, or a man-made disaster, right? And then suddenly we're having these ripple effects within our body, or suddenly we're feeling more cranky or moody, or we're yelling at people we care about more. Um, that is often a normal reaction to an abnormal situation. And to me, I like that because it just helps, validate that a little bit and normalize that. That does not mean, and again, from the circles there, you can see, yes, there are some people who it does end up moving into a psychiatric issue, or something that is very symptomatic and it might be PTSD, and that is a thing that does occur for some people. But what research continues to show is that the vast majority of individuals who have been through difficult things have normal reactions of, fear and shock and distress. And to me, that's such a hopeful thing to know. I think this has been misunderstood, and sometimes I think um, media, maybe very well-meaning media, will come in. Oh, how, and sometimes we would see this after a disaster. Oh, how many people have PTSD in your shelter? Well, first of all, that's impossible to say because not enough time has passed. The disaster was just 2 days ago, right? But we don't want to sensationalize that inappropriately, because the majority of people, it will be normal reaction to an abnormal situation. So. I love this idea from the French about this interior um, library, that an invisible shelf that we carry inside with every story that's ever shaped you. And we could say this about so many things, but it's this idea that yes, events, just to say it's a normal reaction to an abnormal situation, doesn't mean it didn't affect you. It is in there, right? And somebody might ask you about that, or it might impact, how you approach the next time you're in that kind of scenario that reminds you of that disaster or that adversity. Of course, it's not to say it doesn't affect you, right? Like books in a library, they're in there, they're stories. Um, but they don't have to be constantly open, or the primary thing that we're looking at. The other point, very similar to this, is this idea, and I've referenced this a little bit, but post-traumatic growth. I'm very proud to say that there are two psychologists from North Carolina, Dr. Rich Tedeschi and Dr. Lawrence Calhoun, who came up with this terminology, the post-traumatic growth, which has now caught on worldwide. It's now become very PTG is just a very common kind of phrase that gets used post trauma, post adversity. And again, back to this idea that that is much more common than PTS or PTSD, PTG. So more common than the stress is the growth, right? So if nothing else, to me, that would be one of the important pieces I hope you might walk away with, that we do grow from things that are terrible. Um, I wanted to share, I learned about this recently, that some of you might have know about this or read about this, but there's this biosphere in Arizona in the 1990s. They were experimenting with growing environments, and in there, it's kind of like a greenhouse kind of effect. And like what I think in preparation for other planets, and other places that could life grow, and would how would plants do in other environments, that and one of the interesting findings that they so the trees grew, and the trees grew really tall, but what happened is they did not have any wind in this biosphere. And so the trees grew tall, but they were very weak. They fell over very easily. And so what I wrote there is the trees failed to develop what they call the stress wood. There's a more scientific term for it, but stress wood sounds good to me. But because they didn't have the wind that allowed them to develop that structural strength and roots. And to me, when I thought about how, isn't that, we could think about a parallel with humans, right? So, to some degree, not that we're looking for adversity or distress, but when we have that, it is part of what strengthens us. It is part of what helps us grow and develop tools. So I love nature metaphors, and to me, this was a great one that we're not looking for that, but frankly, it does help us grow stronger. All right, let's move to defining a little bit about what is resilience. So resilience comes from the Latin word that means jump back. There's various words that get used interchangeably. Some of them fit better than others. Bounce back factor, ego strength, grit, tenacity, ability to bend. But really, what we mean by that in general is what helps people adapt over time to hardships. What's the resilience? And what science has shown is that each of us are born with resilience. We have resilience capabilities. Now, we do seem to be finding out that different people have different ranges of resilience. So some people, again, depending on their life circumstances, they may have a more narrow range of resilience. Other people, again, often related to some genetics, nature and nurture, have a wider range of resilience in terms of capability to expand that. Um, but the good news, and this again is so hopeful to me, is that resilience is teachable, it's learnable, it's shiftable, which is great, right? Like it's not something that is just static. And if somebody has a low well, we wouldn't even call it this, but like a lower level of tendency of being resilient. So if somebody maybe struggled to manage adversity in the teenager time, that doesn't mean they're not going to be good at it when they get into adult years. Um, and again, that to me is very hopeful that, and this is why we're talking about this actually, because it is teachable. It is something that people can, with support and with the tools, can really build more of that resilience over time. What resilience is not, resilience doesn't mean there's no sadness or stress or anxiety. It doesn't, we're not saying by any means that we're trying to prevent stress from happening or that we're preventing emotions from coming up or we're not even saying that this is not a toxic positivity kind of approach. No, in fact, having those emotions, having some of that negative response, having some of that reaction or anger or frustration, that is part of the process. So sometimes that gets misunderstood, like, oh boy, he's been grumpy or she's, had trouble getting out of bed ever since that thing. That must mean she's not resilient. No, it does not mean that at all. Um, there are various factors related to that and timing and coping and all of that. But so it's more about the eventual bounce back. The other piece that I just want to make a note about is I understand, I learned this as I was preparing this resilience talk today, that there's apparently some camps that resilience has gotten a little bit of a bad name because there's been some idea that, oh, does resilience mean we're supposed to be able to tolerate injustice or that we're supposed to just be strong even when, some things we're being treated unfairly or being marginalized or no. No, that's not that's not a synonym for that. I understand that perspective that, and probably some of the time it may get presented or misused in that way, and that's really unfortunate because that's not what we're talking about. This is not about blaming individuals and not asking systems in our society to take responsibility for things. Um, it's, and as I said before, this is not about toxic positivity, like, oh, anything can happen and it's all great. No, no. But I think we just have to have awareness of that. And that was helpful for me to be aware, like, oh, okay, I see, I understand that this word is maybe been kind of misused in a different way, and there's misunderstanding or maybe some fear around it even. So, all right, so let's move on to the idea of building the resilience. So, it's interesting. We have body and mind resilience, and we have to, there's a lot less that we have to do per se when it comes to our body resilience. Like, so when if we get a cut on our hand or our finger, we might clean it off. Maybe we put a Band-Aid on or let it air dry, whatever it is. But there's not a whole lot that we're doing, right? We're trusting in the body to hopefully do its thing, hopefully not get an infection. And just, that's resilience, right? Like the skin coming back, and maybe there's a scar, maybe there's not, but doing that thing. Or even after a surgery, maybe there's certain things and somebody's got to go to PT and somebody might have to do this wound care. But there's not a lot of, we're not, saying to ourselves, let's do this thing to repair. But when it comes to the mind resilience, that is much more of an active process. So, again, that's why we're talking about this today, because it does take a little more, I think, individual kind of action approach than the body. And I think it's just interesting to think about the mind and body difference. All right, so we're going to dive in now to the main part of what I want to present today, and which is about how do we, in terms of the thriving piece. And there's so many different approaches to this, but I'm gonna pick and choose some of the ones that I find are most important, or what I have found to be most helpful. So there's this idea of a healing triangle, which includes time, connection, and coping. Um, I like the idea of just kind of trying to simplify it into the, main things that really matter when people are healing and seeking out resilience. I want to say something about time, though, that's interesting because it's not, I think there's that saying, time heals all wounds, and I think that's a little bit of a misnomer. I mean, I think time gives you capability to heal all wounds, but time passing all by itself doesn't mean that someone is, actually actively working on the coping tools. So, I think we sometimes, it's not just like, well, just wait 6 months and then it'll be better. Yeah, there probably will be some differences, but I think that's kind of a nuanced kind of thing. Um, with connection, I love there's this concept, an African concept of Ubuntu, which is about that individuals and connection. We are wired for connection as human beings, and there is no question that part of the healing for all humans is having social connection and social support. Um, Many of you may have heard about that, some of that headline that was making the news about, being lonely is like smoking 15 cigarettes a day. And I think it's a very creative way to just uh, wake us up to be like, wow, okay, we need people, we need connection. It doesn't mean we have to have a huge social circle. It doesn't mean that introverts are not uh, honored, but it means, we need some of that. But I'm not really going to talk a lot about the time or the connection because or yeah, the social connection, because I think those are more straightforward. But I do want to talk a little bit more about the coping. Um, and when I think about coping, I like to think about it in two different categories. So there's like the attitude of coping and what I'm calling the actitude of coping, which really just means action. So, because part of it is how we think about it, and part of it is what we do with it. So the think and the do part. So attitude and action. So, um, and I've put together this just very simplistic acronym of SURF, positive coping, learning to surf. And we're going to go through each of these for me to explain what it is I'm referencing. And again, I didn't come up with all of these, came up with the acronym, but I didn't come up with all of the the pieces that have been found to be really effective in helping people get through adversity. Some of you might be familiar with DBT, dialectical behavior therapy's idea of surfing. And this is not that exactly, although certainly there is some connection with that, learning to surf distressing emotions and distress tolerance. But this is what I'm pulling out with the SURF acronym here, is more of the focus on what are four domains that really help in adversity and distress. Okay, so we're going to go to the first one, which is settle the self. Um, and I think about that in terms of physically and psychologically. Um, so physically, I find that, and again, this I really when I did a lot of my work, I'm not doing that currently, but in the disaster work, one of the first things we learned in disaster training was it wasn't so much as mental health professionals, we first needed to ask things like, when did you last eat? How is your sleep? Right? So some of the basic foundations of physical well-being that in distressing times sometimes get kind of lost in the shuffle. Like, oh yeah, I haven't had any water in hours, or oh my goodness, I have to go to the bathroom, or oh my gosh, I am really tired and I need to lie down. So it sounds simplistic, but actually in major disasters and even, terrible news headlines, it's, might be really tempting to want to watch late into the night and all of those things, but then we're really impacting our sleep and our well-being overall. Um, and I now am in a routine with all of my clients that I see in terms of this idea of asking about. So depending on what's going on, but tell me about your eating, tell me about your sleeping, and tell me about um, have you had fresh air today? Have you been outside for 10 or 15 minutes? Maybe it's a walk, or maybe it's just sitting on some steps in the fresh air when it works out. So there's the physical settling of the self, and then also the psychological settling of the self. And I have a little first aid kit listed there because we all know about first aid kits with, Band-Aids and alcohol swabs. But I also like to think about helping people think about what's your psychological first aid kit? What what do you know helps you when you're in distress? Is it, some photos of loved ones? Is it your journal? Is it, your pet? Is it, what is it? Is it your fidget toys? What is that? And some people might make that in a very tangible way, but even if it's not tangible, do they have a note section on their phone where they remind themselves, what is it that psychologically really helped me? And to me, just like if we can tap into that before a disaster or an adversity, the better. But sometimes we're having to do that in the midst of it. Um, I have that little uh, a ball there, like a snow globe kind of at the bottom there because and I have a snow globe in my office where I sometimes will take it out and talk about how like when we're in a really distressed place, it's almost like we're shaking the snow globe and it's really hard to see clearly what's going on and what we need and what people um, are doing around us, and things are confusing and it's overwhelming. And often we just need to hold the snow globe and let some of that snow or whatever that is inside of it to settle down. And to me, it's a nice visual. And then I found this, I'm going to share this little video clip that turned out to also talk about a little snow globe. And but it's about one of the ideas of settling, as many of us know, is about breathing. And there's this, and it's kind of cute because it includes some kids. So I'm going to just share about a minute of this video as hopefully a visual reminder of what we're talking about. And I'm gonna skip a little bit and jump ahead. Just
And it's like spinning around, and then you don't have any time to think. And you sometimes punch stuff and people when you don't really mean it. When I get angry, I feel it in my heart. I really don't like when I get angry. The amygdala really reacts, but the prefrontal cortex tries to keep it down. When I feel like I want to, get really angry and yell, I just sometimes, take deep breath. First, you find a place where you can be alone. Then you find some way to relax and calm down. When I need to calm down, I take deep breaths. I breathe in through my nose. Sometimes I close my eyes or just take deep breaths. And it's calming down, it's not moving. It's slowing down and then it stops. And the heart pumps slow and then it goes into your brain. It's all the sparkles are at the bottom of your brain. My brain slows down and then I feel more calm and then I'm ready to speak to that person.
Okay, so I'm going to stop that. Pretty cute, but it's called Just Breathe, and it's about a 3 minute long. But I just love how simplistic it is about this idea. That's part of settling the self, in terms of, the S of settling. Okay, the U, unhook from unbalance. And the metaphor I like to use for this is this idea of kayaking, like that little video clip there, um, that under distress, we have to kayak in both directions, so to speak. Meaning, sure, there are times where, if we've had a house fire or we've had an accident, there are things we need to do related to that, right? There's cleanup or there's paperwork, but we also need to be on the other side of that, to take a break, to slow down, to watch a funny show, whatever that is. And what often can happen is that under distress or under adversity, we, not meaning to, but many of us will kind of what I call um, putting the paddle on one side only. And for anybody who's done any rowing or kayaking, you know that if you're only rowing on one side, you're kind of going in circles. You're not making forward progress. And so it really is this idea of doing both. Again, a fairly straightforward concept, but it's interesting because I think, we're all like, well, let me just get this done, or let me just do this thing. And sure, but again, that's where the time piece comes in. And really about, I put the little pie chart there, just this idea of the balance. I sometimes think about, that I talk about it like acing your day, ACE. So, having some accomplishment, some connection, and some enjoyment. And when humans don't have that balance, we often end up feeling off, and it doesn't work very well. So attention to balance. Oh, and this is pictures, to remind me again about a balance. Again, a nature metaphor that I love. This idea about um, trees being, when if they're too floppy or too fragile, they cannot hold anything, right? The snow might fall right off, or we can't lean on them. But if they're too rigid, snow or whatever it might be, or wind is going to break the branch, right? So this idea that we are aiming for that balance, the just right, the Goldilocks just right kind of approach. Okay, and then the R of surf is the refocus on the can do. And I'm guessing many of you have seen this idea of the concentric circles of what do we, things that we can control and things that we can't control. Um, or Stephen Covey likes to talk about it in the 7 strategies for highly effective people, things that we can influence and things about which we have concern. And that's also a nice way to think about it, right? It's not to say that we're not concerned about the things in the outer rim, but we may not have a lot of influence on some of that. right? But the things that we do have influence on are the ones that we want to be able to focus on. Um, my little picture there with the tools is just to remind me to, I like this idea that, we may not have been, it might not have been on us that the toolbox got, uh, it fell on the floor and the tools are all over the place, right? That might not be on us. That's not our fault necessarily, right? But we get to decide, are we going to pick up that saw from the handle or from that sharp edge? And to me, it represents this idea of, again, what can we do? What are we in charge of? How can we approach, adversity and trauma skillfully with more of a can-do approach? So, um, I think I'm going to skip this next little video clip, but I'll tell you about it just in Frozen, a Disney movie, but Frozen 2, one of the songs that really reminded me of this idea of can do is this, what is the next best step? And again, I think sometimes when we're overwhelmed, we're thinking way far ahead. Oh my goodness, what am I going to do in 6 months? What about that anniversary date? What am I going to do over the holidays? How am I going to, all understandable, right? But really, we got to bring it back to what is the next best step? What is the thing we can do today or tomorrow or in the next hour? And often we need to make it way smaller to make it much more effective, right? Um, so we're gonna pass. Oops, gonna pass that. And then the F is the find the flourishing. And again, it sounds fairly straightforward, but it's actually harder to do often when we're in distress or when we've been through a disaster or we've been through some really tricky things, to find that pleasant thing, that rainbow, that positive gem in our day that reminds us of some little bits of good. I like this concept of kintsugi from Japan, which is when, I may not explain it exactly right, but this idea that when like a bowl is broken and it's mended with some gold patterning, it's not to say it's it makes it more interesting. It's brought, the gold and the new pattern after some that bowl has been broken, adds actually strength and interest. Um, the picture about the glass of water, I sometimes think about that as diluting the difficulties. And what I mean with that is this idea that if we had a glass of water and we had put in a lot of salt and we tried to drink that water and it would, might taste like ocean water or worse, right? It would be super salty. And if we think about the salt as like a difficulty or a distress or an adversity, um, that, we can't take out, maybe without complex chemical procedures, the salt, right? The salt is in there. The thing that is distressing us or the disaster that happened, it's in the water. So we can't undo that. But what we can do is we can dilute that. So if we take that glass of salty water and we put it in a 1 gallon jug, or we put it in a 5 gallon jug or a 10 gallon cooler, we are diluting that. And so it's still maybe a tiny little bit salty. That thing or those things that happened are still in there, but the water that we've added in, the dilution, I think of that as like that's what can we add in that is more settling, more calming, finding the positives. I just, like that idea to think about, especially during adversity. And it's kind of like panning for gold. Um, so that, there's a lot of mud and there's a lot of dirt, and we could throw out the whole thing, or we can dig in, as we might sometimes need to do, literally and figuratively, and look for the flourishing, to look for the gems, look for the things. Or as Mr. Fred Rogers was saying, when there's a disaster, look for the helpers, look for the people that are helping. I love that. I'm not saying the quote exactly, but it's something, this idea that in distress, there is always that exists, and sometimes we have to look harder than at other times. um, I had a little video clip of the panning for gold, but we're going to skip that too. But you kind of get the idea. um, and some of you might know this quote, the Thich Nhat Hanh, the no mud no lotus, fits with the panning for gold perhaps, but um, that sometimes it is from that mud that something um, different and beautiful can grow. So we're going to wrap up here in a moment. If you want to hear what those surf strategies are again, or a little bit more about resilience, I wrote about this in my mindful metaphor blog that I do for Psychology Today, and the title of that article was "Thriving Through Adversity: Tap into Resilience." It's something I like using metaphors, and you can have a copy of that. It pretty much goes through the SURF acronym if you wanted to check that out. Um, but I really appreciate you all tuning in and listening. And I'm going to, for our last 12 minutes, I'm going to open it up for questions. So thank you for your attention.
Are you okay if I stop recording now in case people
Yes,
do? Yeah, okay.
sure.